Next witness is Janie Peterson.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Your name is Janie Peterson?
Yes.
All right, Miss Peterson. I must ask you the same set of questions I've asked all the other witnesses, and they are. Are you appearing today and testifying under oath voluntarily?
Yes.
All right. Have you been paid by anyone for your testimony other than expenses for coming to Clearwater?
No.
You have a lawsuit against the Church of Scientology.
Yes.
Does the Church of Scientology have a lawsuit against you?
Yes.
Has anyone suggested to you that you should state anything but the truth, or has anyone suggested that you change your testimony for any reason?
No.
Thank you. Would you like to make a statement or say something in your own words?
Yes, basically I'd just like to briefly give you a rundown of my background in Scientology, and then you can ask me whatever questions you want to. I was involved in Scientology for 5 years, from 1975 until July of 1980. During that time period, I held 3 different positions in the organization. The first one was called the Director of Processing, which is in charge of all the auditing that occurs within the organization. I was then promoted to a position called the Technical Secretary, which was in charge of all the auditing and training that occurred within the organization. About a year later, I was promoted to the Guardian's Office, which was the last position that I had. During the time period that I was in the Guardian's Office was the time period when the Hartwells and Lavinda Van Schaik, another lady who was involved in Clearwater, Tanya Burden. This was during the time period when they were all leaving the church and were having various problems.
You were the head auditor?
I beg your pardon?
You were the head auditor?
I was the executive over the auditing that occurred at the Las Vegas organization.
Who devised, who thought up auditing, or who improved upon it? Who devised the test? Who did the training? There must be a training manual that you must use as a teaching aid. Was that you?
No, Mr. Hubbard.
Every technique used in auditing was Mr. Hubbard's.
That's correct.
And then he gave it to you and others, and then you carried it out.
That's correct. You were not allowed to do anything on your own.
All right. I'd like to know what you did in the Guardian's office vis-a-vis these other people that you have mentioned.
I beg your pardon?
What did you do in the Guardian's office with respect to these other people that you have mentioned?
Well, we were... Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell left Scientology very upset. They were... had received a bill from the head office. I'm not exactly sure where, and they were having some sort of an upset. Mrs. Hartwell's daughter was the executive director of the organization at that time. What's called a mission was sent up to the organization from the United States Guardian's Office. I might point out right here that all Guardian's offices are run exactly the same. They all are run by the United States Guardian's Office, which is in Los Angeles. All orders and all procedures that come into any Guardian's office come from the United States Guardian's Office. They operate off the same policies. So there's no difference between the one here and the one in Las Vegas or Utah or wherever. And the Hartwells were subjected to this mission that came up from Los Angeles. They had several meetings with a man by the name of Alan Hubbard, who was taping their conversations, although the Hartwells were not aware of that. Mr. Hartwell's auditing information, copies of the auditing information were made and circulated all over the United States and out of the country. They also went to the Worldwide Guardian's Office, which is in England. At one point, his auditing information was excuse me, it was being used against him. In other words, he was also accused of trying to extort church money from the church. This was based on many, many hours of taped testimony that was then taken and edited down into a very small cassette tape. On Tanya Burden, her auditing information was sent in to the it was sent here to Las Vegas from the Guardian's office here in Clearwater. Confidential auditing information that she had given. It was accompanied with an order to the public relations person in Las Vegas to take to the Review-Journal, which is a newspaper, in an attempt to discredit her, to show that she was this bad person, supposedly, based on this information. On Mrs. Van Schaik, she already spoke about the a program that was written up called Shake and Bake. Basically, all programs that were written up were given a name, and this just happened to be the name that had. The purpose of the program was to, in fact, it was either the first or the second step listed on the program was, the wording was plant seeds of doubt in her mind concerning her attorney, Michael Flynn, and in her husband's mind regarding her character. I really don't remember anything else on that in particular, unless you have some.
No, I just find it interesting that you were the one
that
audited some of the witnesses that have been brought forth before this commission, and
that I audited them.
Well, that you were you were in the Guardian's office that did some dirty tricks with the Hartwells and others.
Yes. Also on the Shake and Bake program, a man by the name of Gary Klingler was sent to Boston to attempt to what they call handle her. In other words, to get her to be quiet and to disassociate herself from her attorney and to drop her lawsuit and to keep her mouth shut, basically. He was sent because he was a friend, had used to be a friend of hers. Also, Pam Bevan, who she already testified was her attorney, or was her auditor, was sent because it was felt that she would respond to Pam Bevan where she might not respond to someone else.
When you use what you learned through auditing about a person, an individual, a Hartwell for one, and others that you have not mentioned, and you concised it down and gave it to the press, did the press use this normally? Or do they check it out to find out who you were and who the Guardians were and then become suspect?
Well, in the instance of Tanya Burden, the press did not use it. In fact, well, he did not use it. And I don't know if it was used in Clearwater. In other words, I do know that it was not used in Las Vegas.
But specifically, did the press, or generally speaking, not mentioning Clearwater or an individual, did they use this information gathered through auditing against an individual as a filler for on a slow day or whatever reasons they used it? If the press didn't use it, then who do you give it to?
Who do you give it to?
This information, their spouse, their loved ones, or... I think Mr. Hartwell said his information, confidential information, ended up in the newspaper. Apparently, the Guardian's office gave that information to the newspaper.
Yes.
Was that commonplace that newspapers would use information supplied to them by the Guardian's office, right to the newspaper?
I don't know on a general basis. It was only done a few times while I was in the Guardian's office. And
I'm just wondering if the newspapers are generally duped by this. So.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. We have an outline of here. Would you like to go into the fair game, the suicides, the blown student doctrines, etc.? Or would you rather us ask you questions?
Well, basically on the fair game policy, I was always told that the fair game policy was canceled, and I believed this to be true until I went into the Guardian's office. And upon entering the Guardian's office, I found that indeed it was not canceled. The actual words fair game were not, to my knowledge, were not spoken, or at least when I was around. However, the practices were, inasmuch as that there was a man Mr. Walters, who had been in Scientology for some time, and he was under suspect from the Guardian's office. He was basically unhappy with some of the things that were occurring, and he was speaking out against them to other Scientologists. And investigations were being done. When I first went into the Guardian's office, to Mr. Walters' background, they were looking for his so-called crimes. There's a policy by Mr. Hubbard in the Guardian's office called Attacks on Scientology, where it says if anyone says anything bad about Scientology, you look into their past because they have what he called blood-dripping crimes. So Mr. Walters, a pre-clear folder, his auditing information was being gone through looking for that. He was expelled and declared a suppressive person, and a list of people, including his wife and his stepchildren, was issued stating that these people were what's called potential trouble sources. In other words, they were connected to Mr. Walters, and that they either had to disconnect from him or they would be also expelled from Scientology. There's a list of about 13 or 14 people. He was...
Are you talking about Mr. Walters now?
Yes. There was a... well, again, I'm referring to the fair game policy. There was a man whose name is Don Cooper, who was a plant, in other words, a spy on Mr. Walters and his friends. He had a code name of Mac. He infiltrated Mr. Walters' group of friends and became very good friends with Mr. Walters and his wife, family, and friends. A Mac would call the Guardian's office at least once a day with information on what Mr. Walters and his friends, and this includes the Hartwells and Tanya Burden, as to what they were doing. There was also another plant, what they called plant. They either called them plants or friends. His code name was Oscar. He later turned out to, actual facts name was Bill Broderick. His main purpose was to spy on Tanya Burden. Yeah. At one point, the United States Guardian's Office was getting upset because not enough information was coming back on Miss Burden's activities. So he was flown to Boston to Michael Flynn's office under the guise of being a disaffected, unhappy Scientologist, and was trying to get Mr. Flynn to represent him so that he could get sort of inside privy type information to what was going on. And at one point it was being considered that perhaps he would then, after a lawsuit was filed and all that, Mr. Broderick would then drop his suit and accuse Mr. Flynn of malpractice and raise a point. I don't know if that was ever totally decided, but it was at one point discussed. Another man by the name of Russ Andrews was brought into Las Vegas from Utah, where he was established in Miss Burden's apartment building. and he was going to become friends with her and give information back to the guardian's office regarding Miss Burden also. Oh, that was never...
How old was Miss Burden at this time?
At this time?
Yeah.
She was about 19, 20, something like that.
Okay. Your outline, you have Scientology, number 3, Scientology policies and practice. Potential trouble source, PTS and disconnect. You have 1, uniformly adhered. Then number 2, policies applies to personal experience, divorce, husband, and give children to husband. Is that something that personally happened to you, or is it common policy?
It was something that was applied to me. At one point when I was in the guardian's office, my husband wanted me to leave the guardian's office. He did not want me to leave Scientology. He simply just didn't want me to be working so many hours and away from my children so much. And I was sort of undecided as to whether I should do that or not. He and I began having a lot of problems over it. I just felt that I didn't want him to push me into a decision. I wanted to make it on my own. And it was causing some problems. I was quite ill at the time. I was having stomach problems and various problems because of this pressure. I was sent to the United States Guardian's Office in an attempt to do what they call a handle. And I was given what they call a chaplain's court, which is basically where a so-called minister of the church comes and gives you counseling. It's like marriage counseling type thing. His name was Paul Schofield. I was told at that time by Mr. Schofield at the very beginning of the interview that he basically didn't care whether my husband and I stayed married or not, that was totally immaterial. The whole purpose of the counseling was to keep me on staff because I was needed very badly. He then wrote up a program of how my husband and I were supposed to handle our differences. And I was then called into the office, and one of my seniors, one of my bosses, told me that the problem between my husband and I was becoming totally out of control and totally out of hand, and that basically what he wanted me to do and what I should do and what others had done was to divorce my husband. And since I had 2 small children and I was financially I would have been unable to support them, that I should give them to my husband because he could support the children, and that I could visit the children on my days off, and that if I did not do that, that I was letting the whole organization down and that there would be ramifications.
What did you do?
I left the guardian's office within a few weeks after that.
Did you leave Scientology or just the guardian's office?
The guardian's office. I left Scientology. It was about a year later. I still did work for the guardian's office, but I wasn't on staff.
Is your husband still in Scientology?
At that time?
At this time?
No.
You both have left?
We both left at the same time, yes. Okay, in the guardian's office, too, I might point out there's various bureaus. It's called, there's Information Bureau, Legal Bureau, Public Relations Bureau, Social Coordination, various organizations. Now, my position was in Social Coordination, which was basically in charge of Scientology front groups. However, it was a very small guardian's office, and they were under what they call attack from the Hartwells and Mrs. Van Schaik and various other people. So I carried out a lot of duties that normally I would not have done. In other words, in a larger guardian's office, usually social coordination doesn't get into those activities, but because of our limited personnel and all the problems that we were having, I carried out a lot of other duties.
Okay, you've got Scientology front groups, Apple Schools, Narconon, ASIs, Citizens Commission for Human Rights, CCHR, GERAS, and the Safe Environment Fund. These are all front groups for Scientology?
Yes.
Are these used to get new recruits and to gain respectability for the organization?
Yeah, basically the purpose of the groups is to, the stated purpose is to, so that Scientology becomes indispensable to the community. In other words, an Apple school will be set up and you will have non-staff members set up the school. However, they'll be very dedicated Scientologists, and they're usually hand-picked.
Do you have any information that any of these five or six front groups are currently operating in Clearwater?
I believe there's a Jarius Society. I'm not sure what all groups there is down here.
There's Narconon.
Narconon, okay.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, many people don't know. In fact, I'm not even sure why you have these front groups. And what is an Apple school? Is that, that sounds like a Beatles group. I know the Beatles had a corporation called Apple, and they would use this for their own promotional material. What is an Apple school? I mean, has it anything to do with the Beatles, or is it, I'm sure it doesn't, but I want to know for yourself. And Narconon, what is that, and how effective is Narconon in treating drug abuse?
Well,
Your view.
Okay, Apple schools are just schools that are set up by Scientology, the purpose of which is to gain respectability and to make the public aware of how normal Scientology is, so to speak.
Can non-Scientology children attend an Apple school?
Yes.
Is that encouraged?
Most of the time, yes, because the fees for Apple schools are the same as most other private schools, and most of the time Scientologists don't have the money to pay. In other words, a staff member's child certainly wouldn't go because they wouldn't have the money to pay for it.
Do the teachers in an Apple school have a certification? Are they certified from the state as to educational standards and practices?
It depends on the state. It depends on what the state laws are regarding certification of teachers in private schools.
Do you want to tell me about Narconon?
Narconon is a rehabilitation drug program which is run by Scientology. My experience was that it was not very successful. I really don't know about any of the other ones, but all these groups are set up, and there's various programs in the Guardian's office on how to set them up. Also, part of the training you receive while you're in the Guardian's office is that if you're asked by anyone if the Guardian's office runs these schools, you're to tell them no. You're to say that you're a consultant, or that you help out, or that they use the technology of Scientology. However, you're never to tell outside of the Guardian's office that you are in fact running it, or that money goes into the Church of Scientology from these groups.
Was the Church of Scientology successful in getting Narconon in Pinellas County or throughout the country? Were they successful in getting this?
You mean successful in establishing it?
In establishing it and setting up business.
I really don't know.
What is an ASI?
Applied Scholastics Institute. It's
Like what?
Applied Scholastics.
What is that purpose of ASI, Applied Scholastic Institute?
It's to people that are having problems in certain areas in their studies or reading.
Primarily for school children or college-age children, or for adults, or two?
It's primarily for school children. However, they do accept people of all ages, as far as I know.
Citizens Commission for Human Rights. What is that? Is that a civil rights group?
It's a group that is purpose is to expose psychiatric abuses and to cause what is called black PR, in other words, bad public relations for psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health, to do everything necessary or everything that's possible to get rid of psychiatry and psychiatrists.
It has nothing to do with civil rights or human rights as we know it with
It's only to expose
expose
psychiatric abuses.
nothing to do with minority rights. Jera Society, is that for the elderly?
Yes, and that's just to expose problems within that the elderly people have.
I have personally heard members of the Jera Society on various talk shows around Pinellas County at various times.
The whole purpose of all these programs were set up particularly by Mary Sue Hubbard under the direction of Mr. Hubbard, and they were to gain good public relations for Scientology.
And the Safe Environment Fund, what is that?
The Safe Environment Fund was a fund that was set up to collect funds and support for the convicted or the indicted executives of Scientology, Mary Sue Hubbard, Jade Kemper, those people. At all times, we were told that this was a big conspiracy by the government, that was the reason these people were indicted, and that these people had ever done anything wrong. It was not illegal, that the government had no information that was correct. We were not told that they were indeed guilty of the crimes, or that they even later pleaded guilty to the crimes.
Back to the Guardian's office. Did you see the program? You mentioned programs in the Guardian's office. Did you see the programs in the Guardian's office? You mentioned the word program.
Oh yeah, there was many programs. Everything you do in the Guardian's office is off of a program. You don't do anything on your own.
Did you participate in them? Did you see them? Could you tell me about them?
Well, there were so many of them. Everything you did, like I say, was based on a program. And if you were going to set up a Narconon drug program, you worked off of a program. If you were going to go to the police station and try to get Mr. Hartwell arrested for extortion, you worked off of a program. Everything was on a program.
On that point, I might mention that before the hearings conclude, we will be introducing a packet of Guardian's Office programs in the city of Clearwater, Florida, which are probably about 2 inches thick, a copy of which will be given to each commissioner. And that was just Clearwater during a specific period of time, and only the documents that we could get our hands on. And there were approximately another 80,000 documents which were destroyed before they were received, and they were all what they call red box documents, which contained the most sensitive and highly secretive operations of the Guardian's Office.
One program I remember in particular was, at one point, the gross income of the flag land base, the Fort Harrison here, dropped to about $1 million a week or a little below, which was considered to be a heavy drop because they were most of the time making between $2 and $3 million. At that time, the staff members at the Fort Harrison for the following week, their diet consisted of beans and rice as a punishment for this gross decline of their income. Somehow this information, I'm not sure how, got leaked out to the public, and I believe the press, and a program came into our organization in Las Vegas with all this information on it, and how we were supposed to handle with the press this fact. In other words, if the press asked us about it, we were to tell them how nutritious beans and rice were, and to also change the subject. In other words, we would say beans and rice are nutritious, however, the abuses of psychiatrists are really something you should talk about. If you get my meaning. I mean, it was like, just a little bit of information and then drop it. That was part of the public relations training. If somebody asked you if the wall was blue, in other words, you might or you might not admit to that, but you would then talk about how horrible the pink wall was, in other words.
You throw the blame on someone else.
Yes.
When you had Narconon and programs and others, did you ever have any MDs or DOs or anyone on your staff that has passed the state board?
On the staff, no. Although you were supposed to send the addicts to a doctor if there was problems.
But how could you get credibility without anyone running these programs having the educational background to back these principles up?
Well, I really don't have too much experience with other drug programs, but it was basically PR, you could go in and you would have to get all the licenses by the state and follow the rules and regulations set up by the state or the city. And you would also assure them that, a medical doctor was available and that type of thing. Okay, basically, a lot of the setups and questions that you're asking in that area were part of what they call B1, which is Branch 1, which is the Information or Intelligence Bureau. I was not real involved in that, so I really don't know exactly how they handled that at some times.
Just for my curiosity, when and why did you get in the Guardian's office?
Well, it was considered a promotion, basically, and...
Did you feel like you're like it's a bunch of elitists that you'd...
Oh, yeah, you were told that. The requirements to get into the Guardian's office were quite high. In other words, you had very intensive testing before you could get in there. You had to be a true blue Scientologist. You had to have a certain IQ. You couldn't have a history of real heavy drug use, or you had to have a stable background.
Apparently you had to be rather bright to get into Guardians, and why do then the Scientologists prefer to have their people uneducated?
I really don't know.
When school is evil, from what I've heard from other witnesses. Were you trained to be a guardian?
Oh, very heavily.
Can you tell me something about the training you went into to become a guardian?
Okay, well, as I said, when you first... Normally you'd be approached to come into the Guardian's office. Someone would approach you, usually the assistant guardian who is in charge of the Guardian's office. And after you went through severe, intensive testing, you would be accepted, and they had various training levels. You'd have just general training levels, which would show you kind of the inside scoop on the Guardian's office. One of the very first things that, first of all, you were locked up. It was always locked up. You couldn't have any windows open or anything because of security. They were very heavy on security in the Guardian's office. One of the very first things that you would be taught would be shredding, what they call shredding, which basically would just take a piece of paper, perhaps, that you didn't want anyone else to see because of what was contained on that, and you would put it in the shredding machine. We had a shredding machine. Also a procedure called vetting, and that was when you would get these various programs in or orders. Anything that you didn't want anybody other than a Guardian's office staff member to see, you would take a razor blade and cut that portion of it out. Now, included in that would be anything that would show who the order came from. In other words, if I would receive an order from my boss, I would shred out, or vet out rather, the area that showed who the order came from, also who the order went to. Then you had to have a code so that you wouldn't get all these orders and confused. You had your own personal code, so you might put a little star by if it came from one person, or a little, another type of mark if it came from someone else.
For the record, Exhibit 16 is the policy vetting write-up to which the witness just referred.
Okay, anything else that might be vetted would be anything would be considered sensitive. In other words, on some of the programs, like the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, there was a couple of lines in there about obliterating psychology and psychiatrists and that type of thing. Okay, you would vet out that area so that if anybody looking at it would think, oh, this was a really nice program just designed to help people who've been harmed. In other words, the real purpose of it would be vetted out so that it wouldn't be shown. Another thing that we were trained on was how to avoid subpoenas, how to handle the press. They had special...
How were you taught to handle the press?
Always attack, never defend. Mr. Hubbard said that it was impossible to defend, so you would always attack. There was also training on how to handle your attorneys, which was basically just to tell them what to do. And if you ran into an attorney who wouldn't do what you told them, you then would fire them and find someone else. How to handle public officials.
How do you handle public officials?
Well, basically it depends on what they're after, or what you're after, really. If they make any type of a comment that you think is a slur on Scientology, you then attack them. Any public official that you were going before, an investigation would be done by the Information Bureau. Their background would be checked out very, very thoroughly. And let's say, for instance, you found out that there was something in their past that perhaps was not, you think that they wouldn't be known. Rather than coming right out and saying it, you would make an insinuation about it, rather than coming out. Another part of the training was what they call FBI raid drills, which you would pretend that the FBI was coming to raid your organization, and you would practice on how you would take care of that. Also, whoever was in charge of the Information Bureau, whoever would answer the door, in other words, and let's say the FBI was there and they saw the subpoena, whoever would answer the door would stall while the Information Bureau man would take all the real sensitive material that was in what's called either the gray file or the red box, would take that information and shred it while stalling the FBI. Also, if there was any threat of the FBI or the police or anybody coming to the organization, the gray file, red box information, and other information was taken to what's called an outside location, which only maybe 2 or 3 people within the organization even knew about or knew where it was at. That was the usual training that we had.
Were you trained in actual dirty tricks? Were you trained in dirty tricks like breaking and entering?
Yeah, I was never trained in dirty tricks. So, however, the Information Bureau was trained on that. In fact, one of the drills, what they call drills, in other words, the practicing they did in the Information Bureau, was a drill called Tell a Lie. The purpose of this was to learn to lie well. That was for the Information Bureau. I was never personally taught that, or observed intelligence people doing.
Okay, I have many questions, but I'm going to turn over to my colleagues. Now, Mr. Burfield, I think we should start with you this time, I believe. Before we start, Mr. Flynn, you have some information?
Oh, okay. At the time that I was in the Guardian's office, there was a girl who I had been friends with for many years. Her name was Carol Garrity. She was in charge of public relations at the time. She has a lot of information regarding the various activities that myself and other people have testified to, because she was actually the person who would do public events and that type of thing.
Do you have any information that dirty tricks are going on within the city government now, or the city officials within the city of Clearwater?
Within the city of Clearwater? Yes. No.
You have no knowledge of that, or the answer is no?
I have no knowledge of it.
Okay. Mr. Burfield?
Yes, Mr. Flynn made reference to this red box item, and then you later alluded to it. What would there be in something like that?
Well, when I was in the Guardian's office, I really didn't know, other than the fact that it was obviously very, very sensitive because it was kept someplace separately. And when I heard reference to it made, I asked the man that was in charge of it, and he said that I wasn't allowed to know what was in it.
Question, I'm still not sure, what motivated you to get into Scientology?
Scientology?
You personally?
A friend of my husband's came up and discussed Scientology and the benefits and all the problems that he'd had and how much it had helped him. I was having, I had a history of having headaches occasionally. I also had a condition called hypoglycemia, which is a medical condition, low blood sugar. He told me that that could be, that it was found that was a psychological type problem, that it could be cured. He said that they had a lot of classes and a lot of different things that would help me with my children, that I'd be able to communicate better, that it was, raised your IQ, a lot of different things. He gave me a book entitled Miracles for Breakfast, which is about children, and it seemed like a good book. I just decided to check it out.
Now, these cures, were they supposed to come through what they call auditing courses, or?
Yes.
Did you ever take any of these courses?
I took, at one time, up until New Aerodynetics came out, which is delivered here at the Fort Harrison a couple of years ago, I had received the largest amount of auditing that anyone could get.
And what did they do to help you?
What did they do to help it?
Yes.
Oh, I mean, I still have the problems, if that's what you're referring to. I mean, I still get headaches, and I still have hypoglycemia.
So all the things that they told you that they would help you with, they did not help you, is that correct?
That's correct. They told me I'd be able to communicate better when, in fact, from my own personal experience and my observation of other Scientologists, they can't communicate as well because you learn a whole different language, and other people don't understand. I couldn't even communicate with my own mother, who I'd always been very close to, because she didn't understand what I was saying, and I didn't know how to tell her what it meant, really.
When you were taking all these auditing courses and you found out they didn't help you, and then you went on to, as I understand, to help other people with auditing, wasn't there some doubt in your mind as to the validity or the deception of these courses?
I believed that I would get handled at the next level. In other words, when I would complain about it or I would be having problems, I was told that it was the next level. Then I was told that, well, particularly when you go clear, what they call clear, which is described in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, that this would take care of all the problems, and that somewhere along the line it would get taken care of. So I believed this to be true at the time. After I went clear, and then I did above clear, there's what they call OT levels. I know you don't want to go into kind of the beliefs of it, so I'm a little hesitant to go into it too heavily, but there's just a certain level that you reach that for me was very damaging as far as my dependency upon Scientology. After I took that particular level, I believed that I needed more and more auditing to take care of the problem. It was not a problem that I had entered Scientology to handle. In other words, I hope I make myself clear, but it's like I went in for various reasons, and as I went higher and higher, I began to forget about the reasons I came in, and I became almost consumed with handling this one certain area.
So the purposes of which you went into Scientology, you never really accomplished those.
That's correct.
But yet you kept on with these courses in hopes that they would help you. Is that correct?
That's correct. I spent about $40,000 trying to handle it.
Now, you made reference to Hubbard's saying, is this direct conversation with him, or is this just something that was communicated with you?
Well, it would be, I never had a direct communication with Mr. Hubbard, but there was many, many tapes by Mr. Hubbard, and there was also policies written by Mr. Hubbard.
Well, we had a lot of testimony on the policies. Now, I think you said Clearwater was the flagship or the head ship. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you were in Las Vegas.
Yes.
So you were, to a degree, in a regional office then. Is that right?
Yes. It's called an outer area is what it's called.
I guess what I'm trying to get straight in my mind is, how did you know for sure that the policies that you had were Hubbard's policy, and why didn't you just tell him to stick them in his ear or something like that?
Well, I knew they were Hubbard's policies because they were signed by, with his name, and because Scientology operates on Mr. Hubbard's policy. I mean, Scientology belongs to Mr. Hubbard, and nothing is done without Mr. Hubbard's written consent. It's not like Joe Blow decides to, do something. It's all Mr. Hubbard.
Well, let me use a comparison here. If it were the corporate world, and you if you were the corporate world and you had a policy and you disagreed with it, you'd gamble on changing it or doing something about it. Did you ever think about that?
Yes.
Why didn't you do something about it?
I tried many times.
But again, did you have the right to challenge these policies, to write back? I guess I have to use the expression, how did you know that it wasn't some clown like Jim Burfield that was writing up these policies for you instead of L. Ron Hubbard?
That's a good question, but I might just point out at this point, the inquiry is into the organization, so the relevancy of whether it was Hubbard's or the organization's, that's the proper focus. But if the organization is practicing it, that's what the focus of the inquiry should be. So whether it was the clown or whether it was Mr. Hubbard is somewhat irrelevant if the organization did it from a legal point of view.
Okay, but that's what I'm getting down to is, that you just practice it because it was Hubbard's policy?
Yes. There was orders. All the orders were based on Hubbard's policy.
Do you know, did everyone practice this, whatever the policy would be that Hubbard would proclaim?
Yes, it's all over. They're all uniform. The Scientology is Hubbard, as far as I'm concerned. Anything else was considered what they called out tech, in other words, out technology. If you did something that was not based on Mr. Hubbard's policy, you'd be sent either to ethics or what they called cramming, where you would be shown that you were not practicing Scientology. It was called either out tech or it was called squirrel tech.
In some of your earlier testimony, you also made mention to a Mr. Walder and Mr. Hartwell. Are those the same two people that testified earlier here?
Yes.
You know that to be a fact that they are the two that testified before?
Yes.
And in these, you also said that you were told that the fair game policy was done away with, but then when you got in there, you found out that it still was in effect. Is that correct?
Yes.
Didn't you at that time challenge the truth and, the truth of the whole organization? That they're telling you, we've done away with it, but yet we're still practicing it?
Well, I was told that it caused bad public relations to use the name fair game. Also, I did at various times doubt many of the things that were happening within the organization and within Scientology in general. However, I still believed mentally that I needed Scientology to get rid of the problem that I had.
Now, I also understand you to say that you were involved in the attacks on the Hartwells. Is that correct?
Not publicly, but sort of behind the scenes, yes.
Didn't you, in your own mind, wonder whether there was something fair or square about that?
Yes.
Did you do anything about it?
No.
You just accepted it as being the way the company should be run? Or?
I didn't think it should be run that way. However, I felt that there was nothing I could do about it, and at that point, I was so indoctrinated into Scientology, I felt that if I left Scientology, that I would die.
You actually, this was in your own mind that you would die?
Yes. That's part of some of the training I received, that if certain phenomena occur within a person, that it means that they're out of control and that they could die from that, and I believed that that was conceivable that that would happen to me.
Were you ever involved in any of these blown student situations?
I was aware of the policy, however, I did not practice it. I didn't agree with it. At the time that I was in charge of the training in the organization, which is where the blown student policy is applied, I was not as indoctrinated as I was later, and I did not agree with the policy, therefore I did not practice it.
This thread that seems to run through a lot of the conversation, Scientology, if your marriage comes between you and Scientology, then Scientology comes first. Is that the way I would interpret it?
That's correct.
Mrs. Garvey, you have questions?
You said you joined Scientology because you thought it would do something for you. Were you impressed with Mr. Hubbard's background as published?
Very much so, yes.
Were you, when you joined, were you told that auditing was confidential?
Yes.
And that it was based on the scientific technique?
Yes.
What's that?
When you got into the Guardian office and saw how auditing the information was being used, did that not bother you in relationship to your own auditing information?
Yes, very much.
But you didn't have any, there wasn't anything you could do about it?
I didn't feel at the time that there was. I did do some questioning of the man that was in charge of the Information Bureau, which is the bureau basically that gathers all the information. In other words, the Public Relations Bureau would take it to the press or whatever, but the Information Bureau would gather it. There's also files, they're called B1 files, which is branch 1 files. And a short time after I was in Scientology, I was asked to help go through these files. And at that time I found that, well, let me just back up a little bit. When I first went into the Guardian's office and I saw auditing information being used, I was told that it was because these people were enemies of the church and that they were attacking the church and that they had to be stopped, which I didn't agree with totally, but it somehow, if you can understand the state of mind I was in, it made some sense to me, and I accepted it to a degree mentally. A short while later, I went through the Information Bureau files, at which point I found that it wasn't just the enemies or the people that were complaining about Scientology. Scientologists who were actively in Scientology, contributing great amounts of either time or money or both, files, auditing information were being kept in the files on them. Anything that was considered to be out security, which would mean that they left the back door open to the fact that they had sex with someone other than their husband, or that they had a homosexual experience in their background, or that they were involved in anything that Scientology considered to be something that could be used against Scientology.
When you challenged some of the policies, what happened to you?
I was sent to ethics on various occasions and sent to cramming.
You were sent to cramming. What happens in cramming?
That's where you're shown policies on whatever it is you're complaining about, why it's okay to be done, until you have this realization whether you actually have it or not, or you say you do. If you say you do, then it's fine.
So have you actually seen written policies on the fair game, the blown student, and some of the other techniques by Mr. Hubbard?
Yes.
Have you seen a written policy that is in the Guardian office on lying?
I haven't seen the actual policy. I've just seen it practiced.
What were you told when you joined the Guardian office that your duty was going to be?
It was going to be establishing Apple schools, and marking on drug programs was my main two interests. The Citizens Commission on psychiatric abuses was also mentioned. I didn't realize exactly what it meant at the time, but...
So your job, you were told your duty was going to be to establish these worthwhile community organizations?
Yes.
How much were you paid for that?
Oh, it varied depending on the gross income of the week. I was one of the highest executives for a 3-state area, and I made anywhere between nothing to maybe $20, $25. An average week would probably be about $6.
You were the highest paid. Good, good.
No, one of the highest paid for 3 states.
3 states.
$26, you say?
No, the average income was about $6. I said some weeks it was you were paid nothing, or maybe $20, $25. The average was about $6.
How many hours a week did you work?
Again, that varied. Probably 12, 15 hours a day most of the time. During one time period when the Hartwells were causing what's called in Scientology a flap. In other words, they were going to the press and that type of thing. We worked for about 23 or 24 days without a day off, 12 to 14 hours a day. And myself and Carol Garrity, who I already mentioned, became ill at that time. We had bad colds and that, and we were taken into the assistant guardian's office, who's in charge of the guardian's office, and we were told that the reason we had become sick was because of the FBI.
What year was this in particular? Do you remember? Hartwells could probably tell you.
I believe it was 79.
Okay. When you said you got out of the Guardian office, were you routed out, or did you just walk out?
Well, I simply just said that I was leaving, and that I had signed what's called a 2.5-year contract. I wasn't on a billion-year contract, and my contract expired, and I worked for some weeks without being on a contract. I activated a new contract, but because it was only in effect a couple of weeks, and I just simply said I was going and that I would help, but that I couldn't continue the schedule I was and maintain my marriage, and I wanted to stay married and keep my children. So I just basically just walked out, and
so they
and I was
that?
Yeah, I was allowed back in, and I did quite a bit of work for them. That was part of the agreement.
How much longer before you left?
About a year.
And why did you leave? What finally freed you from the organization mentally?
Well, I guess it was just an accumulation of many things. I saw so many things, and I saw it becoming worse and worse. I also saw that the people who had been represented to me as honest, ethical, law-abiding people were indeed guilty of crimes, which I certainly did not agree with. I saw that after being sort of free from there, even though I was connected to a degree, I began to be able to look at exactly what was happening with myself and the people that I knew, and I saw that I was certainly no better than when I got in Scientology. In fact, I was much worse. I was terrified to even discuss the possibility of leaving Scientology with my own husband. I was afraid that he would stay in Scientology. I was afraid that he would write me up to the Guardian's office and that they would then come and take me away somewhere because I had so much information. Guardian's office staff members were heavily under security at all times, and I signed I don't know how many waivers of how I would never ever talk about the Guardian's office to anyone, and if I did, I would have to pay them a lot of money.
Your husband obviously was having doubts at the same time?
Yes, I was unaware of it at the time until we discussed it.
Can you describe a little bit of the harassment that you received once you left, and were you given a freeloader's debt?
I was never given a freeloader's debt, no. Once I left, I was received a lot of phone calls where people would just call and hang up. I also received a note in my car with the words "Watch It" on it. Also, a note was left in my mailbox that said "Die." And I received several phone calls where in the middle, my husband works at night, and I would receive phone calls like 1 or 2 in the morning where a male voice would say "Die," and then they would hang up. Also, at various times throughout the night, someone would knock at my front door, and there would be nobody there. There was something else I was going to say.
That's probably good enough. Did you have to fill out a security check? That thing that's got 100-some questions or something like that on?
Many of them, yes.
Many of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, also on the harassment type thing, at one point after I'd left Scientology, the man that was in charge of the Information Bureau, who I already mentioned, he and I were quite good friends. He and I got together even though I had left Scientology. I trusted him to... In other words, I wasn't really afraid to meet with him. I didn't think that he would try to kidnap me or anything. But when we got to discussing the harassment that I had received, and he tried to convince me that Michael Flynn, my attorney, was the one responsible for it. Oh, yeah, before I came here, I'm afraid to fly. And before I came here, I received a phone call of a crash. I assume it was supposed to be a plane crash. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was just a crashing noise.
And you needed that before you flew, like... I think you're where I am.
I thought about it as the plane took off.
Evidence of that type may be relevant.
Say, who would know of your fear of flying?
It would have been in my auditing files.
And referring to the mayor's earlier comment about whether the Leopard has changed its spots, that particular evidence of the last 5 minutes may be relevant because it's right up to a few days ago.
Before she came today, or this week.
When did you leave? Let me just say, when did you leave, just so we can get this in the right time frame? When did you leave the Guardian's office?
I left the Guardian's office in 1979, officially as a staff member, but I was connected in various ways up until July of 1980.
You left Scientology July 1980?
That's correct.
Right, thank you. Mr. Garvey?
Did you actually see the written report on the fair game against the number of people, Mr. Walters or Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell?
Well, there was various programs, and I saw...
You actually did see some of those reports?
Yes, I also saw copies of Mr. Hartwell's pre-clear auditing information, copies being made of it, and there was an order on Tanya Burden to take her information to the press, and attached to the order was copies of her auditing information.
Thank you.
Mr. Hatchett.
Miss Peterson, listening to you, I think this is a good question to ask you. Were you aware, before coming here, that certain people were going to testify that you yourself looked at the order or was involved in the dirty tricks. Did you know you were going to face them when you came here?
Yes.
Congratulations. That's what I want to say to you. You must be very much dedicated, convinced to come here to testify under such conditions. That's my first comment to you.
Thank you.
Seeing in the Guardian's office under heavy security, that must have been a place of great power. Did you have that feeling most of the time?
Yes. Only to the outside world of Scientology. In other words, to other Scientologists and to the outside world. As far as feeling powerful within the Guardian's office, I suppose there was feelings of that, but you always knew that you were under orders from the higher-ups.
Right. Can you give me an idea, after looking at that order, or some orders on people, if you can, from the best of your memory, like, for example, the Guardian office attack on Michael Flynn?
Yes.
It must have been written up, step 1, step 2, step 3.
Yes, there was also a program to get Michael Flynn disbarred. I can't remember if it was the same program as the what was called the Oscar program or not, but I remember, I didn't read all the steps on it, but there was steps on there to get him disbarred. There was also a step to send letters to former colleagues of his about how horrible he was and that he had this bizarre background that they weren't aware of.
Okay. So this Guardian office undoubtedly had a large budget to do all the things it's supposed to be able to do. Can you give us an idea of what it costs to run these types of clandestine operations?
I don't know how much it cost. It cost a lot of money. I know that if there was ever a request for anything, plane fare to go back to Boston or to fly in somebody from Salt Lake City to spy on Tanya Burden, there was always money. When I was in the actual organization as opposed to the Guardian's office, you couldn't even get money for paper to write down the auditing information. In other words, the auditor, as they're auditing, you would write down what the person was saying. And the staff, who made anywhere between nothing and $6 a week, had to chip in money to buy paper for this to occur.
Well, there was always plenty of money to do these other operations.
Yeah, there sure was.
And in a timely fashion. They never had to wait.
You could get it right away.
It was interesting to listen to you about the vetting materials. I think Mr. Flynn stated that he's going to introduce this as evidence. Did you not, Mr. Flynn?
We already did.
did.
Okay.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Hatchett?
No, that's...
I've got my answer already. Thank you. Did you have an idea about this Safe Environment Fund for protection of indicted Scientologists? That must have been a heavy fund, too, in terms of amount.
Yeah, there was, I'm not sure exactly how much, but many, many thousands of dollars. Another really interesting thing is that we were drilled to tell any public official, the press or anyone, that we did not operate the Safe Environment Fund while we were on what's called post time. In other words, we were to say that it was totally separate. It was something we were doing on our own time. We were not allowed to say that, in fact, it was a big part of our jobs.
Okay. The Guardian office was directly responsible for the operation of Apple schools, but
Yes.
yet you denied this.
Yes.
Did he tell you why?
We were told that the reason why was that if the government and various officials found out that Scientology was running it, that there would be a lot of problems because the government was out to get Scientology.
Do you know for a fact then whether or not these schools may have been up to any state accreditation standards?
The ones that I was responsible for were, yes, they were supposed to be. Whether they were or not, I don't know, everywhere else, but I know mine were.
That I meant by a licensing agent, of some state, county, or whatnot.
Yes, we were, as I said, all the schools that I was responsible for all met up to all the codes and everything.
All right. Can you give me an idea what the average parent may pay for the education of their child at that particular school, any Apple school, under your jurisdiction?
I think it was about $120 or $130 a month, which at the time was about what everybody was paying for other schools in the area. It was about the same.
Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Mr. Shoemaker, do you have any questions?
Yes, Mrs. Peterson, I'd like to reiterate a couple of comments that you've made because I think they're extremely significant. So if I'm being repetitive, please bear with me.
Sure.
Can you describe the overall purpose of the Guardian's office, please?
Well, as I said, there's various bureaus, and each bureau has sort of a different purpose. But the main purpose, there's probably a couple. The main one is to keep everybody other than Scientologists away from Scientology. In other words, if a public official walks into the front door of the Fort Harrison, the person that then comes over to take you on a tour is a Guardian's office staff member if they know that you're a public official. They don't want anyone outside of Scientology to know what's going on. In fact, in the Guardian's office, other Scientologists don't even know. Most Scientologists have no idea, for instance, what happens to their pre-clear information. Another thing is to take care of the press, to make sure that Scientology is well thought of so that it can expand and grow.
And your responsibilities while you were in the Guardian's office run the division relating to these various types of special groups.
Yes, although, as I said before, I got involved in a lot of other things because of the lack of personnel.
But your responsibility, though, was in fact control over those groups.
Yes.
And that includes the Apple Schools, Narconon, Applied Scholastic Institute, Citizens Commission for Human Rights, the Jarrah Society,
yes,
and the Save Environment Fund.
Right.
And it was all, and it would be uniformly set up throughout the country, throughout the world, that those types of activities would be in the Guardian's office.
Yes.
You had made reference to the fact that that Mr. Hartwell's auditing files and so forth were sent to the Las Vegas office. Could you tell me where they came from, if you know firsthand, and the year that they were sent?
Okay.
I'm sorry, Burden. I beg your pardon.
Oh, Tanya Burden?
Yes.
That was sent from Clearwater. Actually, it was sent from Clearwater to Los Angeles to the United States Guardian's office and then sent to the Las Vegas organization, and that was in, I believe it was 1979. It was either 78 or 79.
The types of operations that you described, would your boss or who was head of the Guardian's office in Las Vegas have the authority to do one of those himself, write one up and do it himself without instructions from higher up?
No, you could write up a program. However, it had to be sent to the United States Guardian's office to be approved. You weren't allowed to do anything on your own. In some instances, it would not only go to the United States Guardian's office, but it would go to Worldwide Guardian's office. It would depend on the type of program and who was involved, that type of thing.
So any of those types of organizations would have had to been signed off on by someone, by the headquarters of the Guardian's office.
That's correct. In fact, most of the training the Guardian's office staff members received, they received at the United States Guardian's office.
You had made reference a while ago that some of the conversations that Mr. Alan Hubbard was having with Mr. Hartwell was in fact being taped.
Yes.
And Mr. Hartwell had no knowledge of that.
As far as I know, he didn't know.
How do you know that they were being taped?
I saw the taping equipment on Mr. Hubbard at one point. I also heard Mr. Hubbard transcribing them several times.
And it was the type of equipment that would be hidden under clothes?
Yes, I happened to walk into someplace that I wasn't supposed to at one point, and he had his shirt off and was pulling this off. The tape was edited down also at one point.
And the Save the Environment Fund, which was set up, I believe, as you described it, for the purpose of was it donations, or how were the funds being raised for the Save the Environment Fund to provide legal funds for the Scientologists that were indicted?
In a variety of ways. They would have rallies and meetings and that type of thing, and talk about the indictees and how much money it was costing, and then the people would give donations.
Was it given, or was it, or in many cases, or would it have been forced from individuals?
Well, I don't think it was ever probably physically forced. They were made to feel that if they didn't donate the money, that they were letting down the organization, and then what would happen to the organization if these top people weren't there to defend them against the government? What would happen?
Were records kept, or any kind of published list in terms of who gave what, or anything such as that? I mean, that would be available, for instance, to just the general membership.
You mean to other Scientologists?
Yes.
I really don't know. I don't remember if there was or not.
Were most of their efforts directed towards the members in the church or towards public people? People that are outside of Scientology, in terms of rallies and so forth? Mostly
other Scientologists, although I believe that they made some sort of affiliation with other groups and stuff that were interested.
But it was clearly stated that that was the purpose of raising of the funds?
Yes.
Is that for legal or is that for legal or?
Mayor, I don't have any more questions. Thank you very much.
Call the bank. You have any questions?
Yes, just very quickly then. You substantiate the testimony of the Hartwells, Walters, and Van Scheiks as far as the dirty tricks and activities that you saw come across the Guardian office desk?
Yes.
And you substantiate that the Guardian's office tried to frame or plant criminal activities on people that they described in sworn testimony?
Yes.
And you also said that there was a lot of editing of tapes of undercover and taping that were edited to mislead people like the papers, or in Mr. Hartwell's extortion attempt to make it seem like there was a criminal activity being done?
I know of the one instance that I discussed. I don't know about many times being done.
Okay, but that one specific instance,
Yes.
they edited it down for that?
Yeah.
Follow up on Mr. Hatchett and Mr. Shoemaker's comments, the money for the GO. You said substantial amounts of money were used for this operation, that you could get typewriters when auditing couldn't even get paper. Is that true?
For typewriters?
Yeah, or for other equipment. You said substantial money came into the Guardian's office, or they spent a lot of money for anything from tickets to the equipment that was used to tape Mr. Hartwell.
Oh, yeah, I suppose typewriters also, but I mostly was referring to like airfares and paying the rent of Russ Andrews and Tanya Burden's building, and even giving him a certain amount of money so that he could survive.
Where'd the money come from?
It was sent in from the organization. In other words, a certain amount of the money would go into the Guardian's office.
So you got, what organization are you talking about?
Well, in other words, people would come in the front door and they would pay for their auditing and training within the actual organization, and then a certain amount of that money was sent each week over to the Guardian's office. There was separate accounts and that type of thing. They had like 3 or 4 different accounts.
Oh, so the money that came in from, say, auditing, then directly went, or was part of the money that the Guardian's office used?
Yes.
And that money then may have been used to bug Mr. Hartwell or set up Mr. Flynn in Operation Oscar?
Yes, that's where all the money came from, was with the money that people either paid for auditing, training, or books. It didn't come from outside sources. It always came from auditing and training.
These money sources, did you know at the time when you were in the Guardian's office that they were listed as donations?
Yes.
Did you know that these were tax-exempt donations for a tax-exempt organization?
Yes.
Was it common knowledge throughout the organization that this money was being used for these purposes?
Oh,
at least
no.
in the GO office?
In the Guardian's office, yes. In the regular organization, no. Most staff members have no idea. There's a booklet written by Mr. Hubbard. It's called What Your Fees Buy, and it tells you about how you have to run the organization with the money, and it's used to help pay attorneys' fees against the attacks by the government and that type of thing, but it doesn't say anything about what your fees really do buy.
And you heard, where did you first hear the Hartwells? Did you hear the Hartwells' testimony, other testimony that was given to this body when they gave it?
Yes.
Okay. Who was your ag pro during the time that you served there, or the Assistant Guardian Office, Public Relations Officer.
Who was my what?
Ag Pro
Assistant Guardian?
Oh, the Assistant Guardian Public Relations?
Officer, right?
Carol Garrity.
Carol Garrity?
Yeah, although some people came in from the United States Guardian's Office to help handle the problem at various times.
Who was your AGI during that time? Your Assistant Guardian of Intelligence?
Well, there was three. It started out Bruce Hamilton in the beginning, and then Bruce Hamilton was taken out of the area because he didn't handle the problem. And a girl was sent in from the United States Guardian's Office by the name of Julie Bergman, and then a guy by the name of Dan Salins then took over.
Okay, and because of policy, well-entrenched policy, you're saying that these people had to have known as to what were happening, if it was happening during their time, what was happening to people like the Hartwells or the fair game policy being put into effect.
Are you asking, did other Scientologists know about it?
No. Did these people that were in charge know about it?
Of course they knew about it. They ordered it.
Okay. And I see a pattern shaping up with the GO, and it goes back to the training routine of how to lie to someone. Even though you set up and ran the schools, the Jarrah Society, etc., you're actually told that they were that you were not involved, basically, that you would help, etc., but you were told directly to say, no, we do not run them up, we do not set them up, etc.
That's correct.
And when you worked on these programs, Scientology covert programs, you were told that you were doing it on your own, and you were not part of the organization. It was your own time. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so basically here, that policy of lying to government officials or lying, this is an example of it being carried out.
Yes.
Would this policy be deviated from at all in Scientology?
No. As a matter of fact, I mentioned about Don Cooper, who was an agent on Mr. Walters and the Hartwells. He, when his cover was blown after myself and Carol Garrity left Scientology, he signed an affidavit, which I later saw, that said that he was acting pretty much on his own. In other words, he volunteered that he was doing it.
But you knew firsthand that that was not the case, that he was part of a program financed by Scientology.
That's true. He later also, after his cover was blown, his freeloader debt was canceled. He owed a great deal of money. He had left the ship and had a humongous freeloader debt, and because of his dedicated service and spying services, his freeloader debt was canceled.
And so getting back to Mr. Burfield's position on policy, you know, your policies always have a reward and a punishment in corporate structures.
Yes.
And if you followed policy, or was a policy always followed from the source, or did the source always write policy, L. Ron Hubbard?
Yes.
And was what the source said followed throughout the world in every organization?
Yes.
If it was policy, it was followed.
Yes. Now, there were some policies that were written by other people, but Mr. Hubbard's policies always took top priority. In other words, if there was conflicting information in two policies, you would always follow Mr. Hubbard's. His was the senior on the area.
And did you ever see a policy ever not rigidly adhered to?
Yes.
You did? And what was the punishment for that? Was there a punishment for not following policy?
Yes, you were either sent to cramming or ethics.
And was it a severe punishment for Scientologists?
It would depend on the severity of the problem.
So if you did not follow policy as a corporate structure throughout the entire Scientology organization, there was a specific punishment, and if you did follow policy, such as following out a program in Operation Oscar to get Mr. Flynn disbarred, you were given an award or reward.
Yes.
And that was a pretty well-structured policy in itself, reward and punishment.
Yes, in fact, that's in some of the ethics policies. It talks about rewards and punishments and rewarding what they call up stats, which is up statistics, people who have followed policy. It's in the ethics policy.
Is the fair game considered one of the punishments for out policy people?
Yes.
And you said that you questioned some of the policies or some of the things you were doing, but you decided not to change it, or you couldn't change it. Why is that? Was it so rigid, or why?
Well, it was rigid, and it was what Ron wanted. You have to understand that the people in Scientology do what Ron wants. And if they think that Ron wants whatever it is they're doing, whether they personally disagree with it or not, they'll do it anyway. The ones that don't leave, or they get kicked out.
If they don't leave and they're not fair game at the time, then people do not do things on a lark. They do it as a result of a specific policy and a specific program laid out in Scientology, and this is the way it goes no matter where you are in the country.
That's correct.
And finally, in the area of these schools and front groups, would you say front groups is an apropos description of them?
Yes.
The Jarrett Society, we have a very elderly population in Pinellas County. Is the Jarrett Society active here in Pinellas County?
I really don't know.
Did you ever see the Jarrett Society in Pinellas County?
No.
Okay, that's all I have.
At the peak of your career and your earning power for all these study, you were making $26 a week, correct?
On a good week.
On a good week.
That would have been a real good week.
Yet, you testified that you paid $40,000 in Scientology while you were working, weren't
Between my husband and myself, yes.
I just wonder how you could make at the peak of your career $26,000. You'd have $26 a week. You'd have $40,000 to spend. Is that something you accumulated prior to becoming a Scientologist?
Well, my husband and I had been married for several years before we got into Scientology, and we had some money, and we had a house that we refinanced.
So then you refinanced your house and things like that for to get this money?
Yes.
To take more courses?
Yes.
How long were you in the Guardian's office?
As a staff member, almost a year, and then almost a year also just as a worker.
As I understand, as a member of the Guardian office, you learned to lie and to give misinformation. How do we know you're telling the truth now? And do you think any of the witnesses that have testified could possibly be dead agents?
Well, first of all, that as far as how you know whether I lie or not, I guess you just have to take my word for it. I mean, I would hardly, though realistically, fly all the way down here when I'm afraid to fly and sit in front of a bunch of people then, in front of television and admit to all the things that I was involved in that I'm certainly not proud of. As far as the other people being dead agents, I don't know exactly what you mean.
Well, I understand. I may be using the term wrong, but dead agenting to me meant that we may be set up, that someone may have come forward to testify and to put Scientology in a negative light when actually they may be setting us up to be outrageous, which then can be verified that they were not telling the truth to make Scientology look good.
Oh, I see what you mean. I don't know. The people from Las Vegas that I personally know, I realize that I know they're on the square.
But as far as you know, that this is not so.
Yes.
You mentioned that a public official's background could be checked. How would you check the background of any public official on this front table?
Well, there was two ways of doing it. The first one was called overt data collection, where you would go to, the public library and look at newspaper clippings and the voters' registration. You'd check to see if they had any kind of an arrest record. You'd check around to find out if they were connected in any way to a mental health organization, that type of thing. There was also, it was called covert data collection, and I really don't know how you would do that. I was not allowed to know that.
If you had something on me, how would you disperse that to the people to embarrass me?
Well,
to the press or to the people at large?
The Information Bureau would collect the information in one of the two ways I mentioned, who would then send it over to the public relations, and it would just depend on what the problem was, how it was handled. I mean, perhaps if the PR person was confronting you and they knew that you had a mistress or something, they might just in passing mention something about people that had mistresses or something. That would be one way.
Okay. So you just in one more, that you did all these things, well, and you went along with all this mistreating of people to get Scientology, or to get more into it because of the, I shouldn't say the faith, but the belief in the organization. Is that correct?
Yes.
One other thing, what about coded telex with reference to Betty Orsini, who I believe was with the St. Petersburg Times, or still is at the Times, and did a story originally exposing Church of Scientology. But I see here, you're sending and reviewed coded telexes about Betty Orsini. Can you tell me anything about that?
Yes, there was a time period when I was receiving and sending all the telexes, and at one point we received a telex from the Fort Harrison Guardian's office, and it was coded, and I then decoded it. And I can't remember the exact terminology of it, but it was something to the effect that Betty Orsini was in town, and no, wait a minute, it said that she was coming to town and what time she would be arriving, and that she needed to be kept an eye on. I gave this information to Alan Hubbard, who I had already mentioned, and Julie Bergman, who I also mentioned, who are from the United States Guardian's Office. And I asked them who Betty Orsini was, and they told me that she was one of the biggest SPs in the planet, and that they were going to have to find somebody really trustworthy to follow her and that type of thing, to see what she was up to. They were afraid that she was going to get in contact with the Hubbards, or with the Hartwells and Mr. Walters and that type of thing. They were very concerned about that.
That was their concern. Okay, that's it, unless you have something you must add, Ms. Garvey.
Just one. Do you have any knowledge of whether Broderick and Cooper or Cooper were ever trained in Clearwater?
John Cooper's in Clearwater right now. I saw him last night.
That must have made you feel good?
Yeah, well, kind of the amusing part about it was that I was with Mr. Walters at the time. Mr. Walters and I were taking a walk, and we saw him. He came out and said hi.
Were any other of the high upper-ups in the Guardian office in your area have any training here in Clearwater that you would know of, or spend any time here?
Well, a man right now by the name of Bob Anderson, who is the assistant guardian in Las Vegas, he came originally from the Guardian's office here. He held a position here. I'm not sure if he was the assistant guardian here or not, but he was in the Guardian's office. He was sent to Las Vegas to take care of the problems.
All right, so I guess in conclusion, you might be saying that the Scientologists have been trying to dupe the press and the people for quite a long while.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate your coming, my colleagues do, and you've shed a lot of light on the issues, especially coming from the Guardian's office, and how it relates to the Hartwells and to other people that we have listened to. So thank you.
Mayor, at this time I would point out for the record that some of the documents pertaining to covert data collection have been marked as Exhibits 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and specifically the document on lying, TRL, has been marked as Exhibit 13. I will have testimony at a later point on an individual who was in B1 who did covert data collection through such things as breaking and entering. At this point in time, I would like to introduce an affidavit of Carol Garrity, to whom the witness has just referred, and I will read that affidavit into the record.
Please do.
I, Carol Garrity, being first duly sworn, depose and say, I was a member of the Church of Scientology from April 1975 through July 1980, and during that time I became a staff member and worked full-time for the Scientology organization from August 1976 through July 1980. Between November 1978 and July 1980, I was a member of the Guardian's Office of the Church of Scientology. The Guardian's Office, more commonly referred to as the GO by Scientologists, is responsible for intelligence gathering, covert operations and activities, spying, and public relations. The Guardian's Office administers front groups such as schools and drug programs which are designed to make money. The Guardian's Office headquarters in the United States is in California. However, the Guardian's Office has the power to go into a local Scientology church and literally take over any section of it or the entire local church if necessary. This is covered in the policy letter written by L. Ron Hubbard entitled The Guardian. The Guardian's Office activities are conducted pursuant to a Scientology policy entitled the Fair Game Doctrine, which states, fair game may be deprived of property or injured by any means by any Scientologist, may be tricked, sued, or lied to, or destroyed. I have personal knowledge that the Scientology organization has actively and covertly conducted operations against attorney Michael Flynn in an attempt to destroy him and thereby eliminate him as a representative of those individuals victimized by the Scientology organization. One such operation occurred between January and July 1980 when the Guardian's Office conducted a series of covert operations to infiltrate the law office of Michael J. Flynn by placing a plant whose code name was Oscar and whose real name was William Broderick. The Guardian's Office devised a second covert operation to stop Attorney Flynn's client, Lavinda Van Schaik, from speaking out against the Scientology organization. The program was codenamed Shake and Bake, and pursuant to the program, GO agents were sent to Massachusetts to interrogate Ms. Van Schaik and tried to encourage her to divorce her husband and fire Attorney Flynn. The Guardian's Office perused Ms. Van Schaik's auditing files, which contained the most personal and intimate details of her life, and extracted confidential disclosures for the purpose of blackmail and extortion. Practice of reviewing confidential auditing files and extracting private and intimate details of an individual's life is a common Scientology practice. The data gleaned from an unsuspecting individual's files is transmitted to the California headquarters for extortion and blackmail. This practice occurs regularly. I have personal knowledge of auditing information being sent to Clearwater and transmitted from Clearwater for this purpose. On one occasion, I received a Guardian's Office order instructing me to remove confidential information from Tanya Burden's file, a woman suing the Church of Scientology, and release it to the media. I executed the order and brought the information to the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I became upset and in fear when I learned that 11 top leaders of Scientology had been convicted of felonies, including Mary Sue Hubbard, the founder's wife. I did not agree with the Scientology practice which condoned burglary, electronic surveillance, spying on former members and others perceived to be critics of Scientology, and all the other unlawful and underhanded conduct that the release of the documents in the FBI raids revealed in the national media. I left the Church of Scientology on July 18, 1980. Dated this 28th day of April, 1982, Carol Garrity. This will be marked as the next exhibit.
For information, do you want to break or do you want to continue on till at this point?
Perhaps if we could take a shorter break than our usual break, an hour instead of 2
All right,
hours.
we normally come back at 2. Commissioners and staff would like to come back at 1.
Well, we may.
All right. Is that all right with Vision Cable? You're the same